Hi everyone in English 1301, it's Dr. E and I'm here for the supplemental video for week 8. And week 8 means we're halfway through the semester. So anyhow, it's exciting. So what I'm going to do is pull up on the screen our readings from the course text, and then I'll talk to you a little bit about choice work after. Okay, so I'm on the Norton's website for the electronic version of our text. So some of you may use this text, but it's really easy to kind of move through, or the print text, of course, that you might be using. So I'm going to talk first about, let's talk about distinguishing facts from misinformation first, and then we'll switch gears to the annotating. And so, as I've mentioned previously, we just live in a time where it's really important to make sure that we are taking the time to determine whether we're reading something that is misleading or offering misinformation, or if we're finding credible, reliable sources, right? And so misinformation, like Lunsford says here, it outperforms real news because it's sensational or outlandish, right? The content of such stories is often negative, so we react with strong emotions, so that gets a lot of attention versus actual reliable information. And then third, misinformation, the language evokes surprise or disgust, right? As compared to accurate tweets, which the researchers found that Lunsford is referencing here, use words associated with trust or sadness rather than surprise or disgust, right? And as those researchers know, the truth simply does not compete, right? So we're living in a time when the truth has trouble getting traction because misinformation is so rampant, and it's more exciting, it's more contentious or argumentative. So a lot of that misinformation gets more attention than actual credible information. Okay, so if we scroll down, of course, all of this is important, but I wanted to highlight just a few things, right? We need to really consider how our own beliefs play into this, right? So it's one thing to spot, something that's unsubstantiated, right? Something that can't be proven or exaggerates, right? But it's another thing entirely to spot them in your own thinking, right? That takes a lot of work, and we have to do that work right now, right? So we need to think about attribution bias, right? Which y'all considered for conversations and discussion posts last week, and that is the tendency to think that your motives for believing, say, that the EPA is crucially important for keeping our air and water clean. The attribution bias leads us to believe that that's good, right? That objective is good. While the motives of those who believe the EPA is not at all necessary are dubious or bad. So that attribution bias has us having a kind of an either-or mentality. Like, this is good, what we believe is good, and what other people believe is bad. It's really easy to get caught up in those conversations. And sometimes news is presented to us in those terms. This is good, this is bad, right? But we have to see between those lines, because not everything is just good or bad. There are various steps in between that we need to consider. Confirmation bias is the tendency to favor or seek out information that confirms what we already believe, right? And anything that's outside of that we can reject or ignore, right? And so sometimes we tend to watch news sources or read news sources that we know kind of agree with our own ideas and ideology versus perhaps more center of the line news sources, or even getting a broad spectrum view. You're not just watching one news television source, you're watching multiple to kind of read in between those lines, right? Or you are effectively and conscientiously seeking out news that is as unbiased as possible, as objective as possible, right? I'm using news as the example here because it's just so prevalent right now, and it's work we really need to do to ensure that the things that we read are factual and accurate, right? There are a lot of conspiracy theories that float around, and a lot of times those conspiracy theories are included on websites that look like news websites, but we have to dig a little deeper, and we have to understand our biases, and so our attribution bias, right, and our confirmation bias as well. Okay, and I think the text, and Lunsford is the editor, and all the editors do a really good job of including some visual rhetoric in here that we can consider. We need to kind of follow some practices to read defensively, right? So we need to triangulate and use judgment. So find 3 different ways to check on whether a story can be trusted. right? We don't want to just take what we read at face value. We can't do that anymore. Those times are way in the past at this point. We need to, what our text calls triangulate, right? So find 3 different sources, whether it is factcheck.org or Snopes. Go to those sites that can, call this bit of information true or not. Before reading an unfamiliar source, determine whether it's trustworthy. This is really crucial. You can follow various steps, like by going to the About section at the top of the page. Who is publishing this? What might their biases be? What are they benefiting from in terms of relating this information? So you need to dig in and not just go to, click on a link that your friend sends you and believe everything that's there. We don't live in that world anymore, unfortunately. We have to research our actual research, right? You need to ask questions and check evidence, right? Double check things that too neatly support what you think. If you're reading and every source on this news site is something you agree with, it may take some time, but double check, right? Go to snopes.org or factcheck.org, look at these kinds of things and determine, whether your confirmation bias is playing a role, right? What is the claim that's trying to be made? What is the evidence that's used? A lot of times with misinformation, there is no evidence. It's just essentially people sharing their opinions or ideas. Or if you actually click on some of the hyperlinks to follow the links to evidence, they go to nowhere, or they go to really questionable websites, right? So we need to do much more work, unfortunately, now with everything in the digital age, okay? So again, we have some really great kind of photos, fact-checking photos. This is a really useful one that you can see Vladimir Putin included, he's the leader of Russia, included in this version of the photo, and he's actually not there, right? So world leaders gathered during the 2017 G20 summit. Russian President Vladimir Putin was not in attendance, despite what it looks like. This is a fake photo. We see a lot of fake photos now, or fake videos, and unfortunately, it's down to us to determine the truth or validity, right? We see videos that are piecing together different days than they claim, or, connecting falsehoods. So we unfortunately just have to be really conscientious and critical consumers of the information that we see online, okay? So that's this chapter, and I want to go back and take a look at annotating, summarizing, and responding, our other chapter. And this is really key when we're thinking about how we work to summarize choice work. So when I talk about our annotation exercises, it kind of combines all of this information, right? So not only are you hopefully annotating as you're reading, annotating means, making those notes, doing that kind of work, but summarizing and responding are also part of those exercises, because you are working to summarize choice work, for example, and you're also responding, that last little brief paragraph that's just a couple of sentences where you are thinking about specific things with what you've read. All of these are included in those annotation exercises, right? We always need to start with thinking about the purpose. Why are we reading this, but also why has it been written, right? So thinking about those, we need to preview the text and look at all these different elements. It's a lot like fact-checking our news. We have to do a little work before we actually do the work, right? So we need to think about some of these questions, and we need to make sure that we're annotating in whatever way works for us, whether it is taking down physical notes, typing up notes, jotting things down on Post-its, whatever works for you. You really need to think about, they write here what the text is saying, but I'm going to argue that it really should be what the author is saying in the text, right? Because texts don't speak to us necessarily. We need to think about the thesis statement, right? Which is essentially the main argument, the main idea that the author is sharing with us. And then what are the reasons and evidence, right? And are there any counter arguments? Who's the intended audience? That gives us some insight, right? Is it for us as college students, or is it for us as folks living in the US, right? Figuring out the audience can help on different levels when we're thinking about understanding. What do you know about the author? This is going to come into play this week, right? And I've asked you to do this in past weeks, to think about, like, who is this person? What authority do they have on this subject, right? What is the author's stance, right? And what are their style and tone? Okay, so really think about those as you move forward and read for all academic work, but of course, certainly for our class. How is the text designed? That usually helps us when we think about summarizing and annotating, because some people, in a lovely way, break it down for us, like Choi has. In different subsections, right? And then what are your reactions? What are your biases, but also what are your initial reactions, right? So that's in a nutshell that chapter. And I do want to talk about Choi's work because, again, she breaks down her ideas into different sections. But overall, her goal is to just really dig into this idea of food culture and how it has different layers, right? So we think about food as humanity and food as community. She really wants us to think about the fact that food plays a crucial role in our lives, but we don't always think about it, right? We don't always sit and have some time to really consider, what is this dish that is important to me on the holidays? What does it mean to me, right? Is it humanity? Is it community? Is it survival? Food serves different functions in different time periods, right? What we choose to eat for breakfast doesn't necessarily have the same impact or cultural connections as what we eat for a holiday in our culture, right? So Choi is really pushing us to think about those, but I really also want you to recognize that she uses a lot of sources to support her ideas. And I've mentioned this before. We can use her as an example. She is pulling in, she's giving credit to all of these people for, their ideas. She's using quotation marks. She's referencing the people who said those words. I want you to really think about using Choi as an example when it comes to using research. I'm going to stop right here and mention the random word for the supplemental video this week, and that's going to be cat. Okay, so when we think about Choi, we're going to come back to her throughout the semester as an example for what we can kind of emulate or kind of copy, share, use in our own writing. Okay, so that's the gist of what we read last week. If you have any questions or concerns about the content or the ideas within those readings, just reach out to me, or you can post in the Q&A discussion area of D2L.